We are drifting into August, resting atop one of the floating islands so popular in the folklore of Lake Victoria, also known as Ukerewe, also known as Namlowe, also known as Nalubale, also known as Nyanza, also known as Lubugumu, also known as Chagwa, and many other names. Long before British explorers arrived to discover and rename this body of water, which also happens to be the largest lake on the African continent and in the tropics, it had already impressed itself firmly on the minds of the peoples whose lands touch its waters. It's just mentioned names in the languages of the Sukuma, Luo, Baganda, Rwanda, Gogo, and Kaguru, respectively, attest to this. We spent the month of July getting to know some of the folklore associated with this lake, specifically the stories of men who come from the lake under mysterious circumstances. Normally, we would be moving on to a new topic, but there are a couple more lake-related stories and aspects of folklore that I would like to touch on before we do. And so in this episode of the Mythological Africans podcast, we will discover the stories of women who come from the lake and then round things up with some lake-related sayings and proverbs. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. Before we get into the thick of things, I'd like to give a content warning. We broached the topic of female sexual pleasure at the end of the episode, so if, according to the laws of the land you are listening from, you should not be hearing about these things from people on the internet, I beg of you to skip this episode and come back next week. Alright, first let's revisit the matter of names. We talked about the lake's various names and the issue of indigenous versus colonial names in the first episode we did on this topic. And I fully agree that it is important to challenge and reject colonial nomenclature. Names are powerful. They are a portal to relationship. They are familiarity given tangible form. And each name for the lake from each of the peoples we mentioned previously speaks to their relationship to the lake as a giver, as a sustainer of life, and also a representation of the mysterious infinite against whose backdrop the realities of their lives play out. But names are also practical, and in this case, the name Lake Victoria functions as, let's call them handles, with which one can carry this massive pot that is the lake and all it means to the people, making it easy to pour the knowledge, the real knowledge about it out. So do I like it? Absolutely not. But I'm not going to spend any more time than necessary wringing my hands over it. Absolutely not. And with that said, let us move on. Stories of men who come from the lake dominate most of the stranger from the lake narratives which exist around Lake Victoria. But there are stories of women who also make this mysterious journey. From what I could gather in the available literature, according to the oral traditions of the Kwaya people of Musoma district in the Mara region of Tanzania, an ancestress came to their present lands from the lake, carried there, as in other cases, by a floating island. And in this account, the fish eagle, which is a bird that features in the oral traditions of many East and Southern African peoples, saves the woman from starvation by bringing her fish. And if you're familiar with the city of Great Zimbabwe, I believe the fish eagle is one of the totemic birds that features so much in their iconography. So the fish eagle is a totemic animal to the descendants of this woman among the Kwaya people. And she is one of many founders of Kwaya lineages who, according to folklore, also come to their present location on floating islands traversing the lake. In another story, a Luo woman floats in and marries a Kwaya man with whom she founded two closely related lineage groups. And in yet another story, a woman floats in from Kweni Island, which is an island on Lake Victoria, and marries a man from Ukara Island, yet another island on the lake. These stories are documented in Austrian ethnologist Hugo Huber's 1973 book, Marriage and the Family in Rural Bukwaya, Tanzania. And unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the book, so I don't know the details of the events, but I'm putting a pin in it for future research because I, as you folks might know, are quite fascinated with the topic of women's founders of lineages or peoples. We did a whole series on them last year. So through these stories, we can see that the people consider the lake a vast and mysterious portal through which they can pass for initiatory stories that transform their community dynamics. And this is important because this relationship will inform the attitudes that people take towards the lake, and itself can be a pathway towards, hopefully, policies that ensure the well-being of both the people and the lake and the surrounding landforms, and would generate, positive and sustainable feedback loop. At least in my eternally hopeful mind, it does, because I would think that it would be hard to sit back and watch a water body or a landform or an animal or a plant that has such an important relationship to the history of your people be treated carelessly. And that really is why I am on this journey this year with nature folklore from the African continent, because in my personal experience, in thinking about the future of the African people and thinking about the present and how we could continue to take care of ourselves and the things we hold dear, I find that often that deep connection to the land will fall out of the conversation unless you're being spoken in ecological terms or in terms of resource management. And a story is a powerful thing to build a relationship. Stepping off my soapbox, let's talk about proverbs and sayings. Now, this is something that I thought was really, really interesting. So you might be familiar with the East African practice of kunyanza or kachabali, which is essentially a technique for causing female ejaculations. And if you don't know what that is, please check the episode notes. Now, if you remember from the episode we did on African sexuality, what feels like, 100 years ago, one of the challenges of studying the topic is that African peoples traditionally tend to speak about matters of a sexual nature in layers and layers and layers of metaphor. So adults could have a whole conversation about sex in front of a child, and the child wouldn't know better. With this in mind, did you know that one of the ways the experience of female ejaculation is referred to is as making Lake Victoria? I will let you all ponder that. I found a couple of other proverbs which reference the lake, and they return us to the lake's mysterious and sometimes dangerous nature. For example, the Baganda of Uganda say Kabakanyanja, which means the king is the lake. And this alludes to the fact that the lake doesn't differentiate between the skilled fisherman and the hapless traveler when it comes to drowning. And in the same way, a king doesn't differentiate between those from whom he demands tribute. You have to pay your tribute. Meanwhile, the Luo of Kenya say, the one which has grown horns dances with the Mayoya, the one with many children in the middle of the lake. And this expression, from what I understand, is used to communicate shock when something strange, usually a calamity or some kind of disaster, happens. The Luo also say Manga Island meets Magare Islands in the middle of the lake. And this also is to express surprise at shocking events. But this second saying comes with its own bit of folklore, at least in the literature that I used to inform this episode. And according to that, it appears that Manga and Magare were two bulls who fought so fiercely they fell into the lake and turned into two small islands. What I find interesting about these sayings is how the lake is positioned as a place of fantastical and dreadful events, which makes sense. It is vast enough to be fathomless. It takes with reckless impunity and gives with unbridled generosity. It teems with life and holds death in its belly. It is the mother of gods. It is the endless waters. We'll be back next week with more folklore of landforms from the African continent. And until then, thank you, as always, for listening.